I would like to say that we're going to have the panel discussion, and so you know we record these live. It's being recorded in the back, and we put it on the Facebook page for motion picture sound editors, which allows our global membership and those that could not attend view the panel discussion and hear from these gentlemen and Carolyn what it took to create this amazing soundtrack, and I applaud all of you guys. Great job.
Thank you. I'd like to believe that this is sort of a special treat for everyone because this is the theater that we mixed the film in. Excuse me, that Ron Bartlett and Doug Hemphill mixed the film in. So if you loved it, that's why. If you didn't, talk to Tom. If you love the sound edit.
So I know a lot of you already know each other, but we're going to do some quick introductions. So we have Mark Mangini, supervising sound editor. Theo Green, sound designer. Re-recording mixers Ron Bartlett and Doug Hemphill. Supervising music editor Clint Bennett. And supervising dialogue editor Byron Wilson. So we're going to spend the next roughly 30 minutes talking about some of the key scenes in the movie, and then we're going to open it up for your questions. So before we go into the first scene, why don't we start with when Denny first came to you and said, I'm going to make Blade Runner. What was the conversation? What was the creative brief that you talked about?
Certainly for sound or sound effects, if you will, Denis' brief was really thrilling and quite clear. He said that he wanted sound. His exhortation was to compose with sound. And that comes from a sort of unique aesthetic of Denis Villeneuve, which is one of simplicity and a sparseness to everything that he does. And he felt that if sound could carry a scene, it was a scene that you then didn't need music for, because he could then save music for the actually really important moments that a score often works best for. So his charge really was, to myself as well as to Theo, was to build sounds in a way that felt like a composition. And to that end, he delivered a first draft of the film, a rough cut, if you will, with no music in it, and said, do what you will. And his final words in that conversation were, do not be afraid to not be logical, which meant, make of it what you will.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is just the city. So we had all of the sounds of the city. We had the advertisements. It was an oppressive environment. What was involved in bringing all of that together, and overall, what were you aiming to convey?
Byron, why don't you jump in about the PAs and the announcements?
Yeah, we recorded kind of a non-traditional group. We had very little, restaurant scenes or anything like that. So all of our group is mainly multi-language. We had Russian, German, Hindi, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and we gave them all these advertisements and all these, all the announcements, the therapeutic chant on the balcony, and we had all this stuff written out, and we provided it to the actors, and they all translated it, in the multi-languages, and we just recorded, always just with, what they think with 10 or 12 different languages. And then we just had them throughout the film. We had them used, and we added some at the last minute of the film, but we used them for all of the advertisements in the city. All of the vending machines we recorded. Theo was involved with a lot of this. The vending machines, all of the advertisements, the crazy advertisements that from the things flying high up above, and from all the signs we fly by, and it was to kind of create the world of it's this multilingual melting pot where we live now, and it's mainly. It was interesting that Denis asked for it to mainly be populated by Eastern European You notice when he goes to one of our kind of a real traditional scenes of group, sort of, was like when he goes to the scavengers, all of the scavengers, after he crashes and the scavengers come and take him out of his spinners, they're all Russian, German, and it's very specific what the languages are of the people, where we are and stuff.
I particularly enjoyed that you cast the off-world voice. Just say a little piece of
Yeah, we actually, the off-world voice from the first movie, remember at the very beginning of the movie, they have the announcement of, off-world, the real announcer, Mr. Announcer guy voice. And then we actually cast a guy to revisit that voice and how it is in this movie. It is an advertisement to, you can link and buy time to talk to people that are in off-world. Rather than you can go to off-world, it's like you subscribe or, yeah, it's too late for that, yeah. And no, it's basically, but we cast somebody. It's one of the things that we did cast to try to mimic that Mr. Announcer voicey, come to off-world, that guy. We cast a specific guy to do that, but this was, and it records, it happens like 2 or 3 times in the film but this time it's, to talk to your relatives or friend or your better off friends that are in off-world, how you can communicate and talk to them.
And on the mixing?
I would say, you guys have just seen the film, it's important to realize with Denis, when you hear this film, that every sound in the film has an emotional color for him. He listens, everything has an emotional color. And Mark and Theo can talk about that because Denis responds to sounds from an emotional point of view. Everything has a tone and a feel to it.
as well as a narrative point of view.
Yes.
There's no incidental sound. Every sound has to say something about a scene.
But I mean, you can speak, and Theo as well, how Denis would be working with Denis and he'd say, I deeply love that sound, but not in my movie. So he's
Oh, I never heard that.
well, sweetest guy in the world, but he does not compromise. And that's one of the reasons this is as good as I think it is. It's because of Denis, he just doesn't compromise.
One of the ideas I think worked so well with the voices that Byron was talking about. Denis had this idea that on the ground level of the city, everything is oppressively, you're being advertised to constantly. It's a nightmare, it's hellish. And the further you go up in the city, up to the top where you see Kay and Joy on the rooftop, he wanted this sort of sense of something transcendental, something zen, something calming, as if there are different layers of life in the city, which I thought was wonderful.
And affluence. And
Yeah.
the sounds would mirror the relative affluence of where you lived in that hierarchy.
You definitely get that. I mean, it's one of my favorite scenes that these guys did the sound for was the rooftop rain scene, because that's one of the few times when Kay can actually have a romantic moment and a moment that maybe life is worthwhile with Joy. So we sort of played the rain as very romantic, and then the moment gets interrupted with a phone call from back at the office, and the real world comes back, the real rain starts to seep back into the scene. I think it's a beautiful sequence. I love that sequence.
So let's talk about that fantastic scene in Vegas when Kay and Deckard have the fight in the room with the hologram. It's a fantastic scene, and what I learned just a little while ago was that it actually almost was cut from the movie, and it had a number of different iterations. So would you talk a little bit about what was involved, and how did you find the sounds that we ultimately hear in this film?
I want Theo to really take this, but I want to explain what you just said, because it's very important about how Denis uses sound and how important what we as sound designers and sound editors and sound creators bring to a film. That was a scene that was envisioned as a very, very different scene with all those bits of hologram that you saw in that room flashing on and off. The original incarnation of that scene was to have every one of those playing constantly, and it was meant as a cacophony of sound. And in its first iteration, when Denis saw the film, when he watched the entire film for the first time, he said, I love my movie, but I don't like that scene, and he wanted to cut it out until... And the point of the story is that sound saved what I think is an iconic scene in this film. And Theo should really elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think the thing that wasn't right for Denis in that scene was the fact that when we had all of these different, it started off there was Elvis, and not just the little sort of snippets of Elvis that you hear now, but like of the whole Elvis song. And then Marilyn Monroe would come in on top of it, and then Liberace on top of that, and it just became this crazy cacophony. And the idea was initially that that would create, you know, the sense that that they didn't know where each other were in the room, and it would add to the confusion of the scene. But I guess it just didn't feel like Blade Runner. It felt like suddenly we were giving too much sort of musical relief, I guess, at that point. There was too much colour and light. And in fact, what Joe and Denis decided was that it needed to be about the manhunt. It needed to be the fact that Deckard, the last time he saw a replicant, it was Roy Batty, and it nearly cost him his life. And I guess he's scared, and Kay is scared as well. So the idea was, what do? We take out all of these layers of music, and luckily they'd filmed all of those performers in separate passes, in separate layers. So in Joe's Avid, he was able to go in and decide, okay, maybe we have a little moment where Elvis is glitching out and we see him for a second. And then what do we do in the spaces in between? And near silence seemed to be the best thing to do. I mean, we had like little, I made these little sounds of sort of tinkling light bulbs, as if there's sort of broken hologram projectors in the roof. And then working with Clint on the music side of it, we came up with these glitches and this idea of a startling burst of sound, and then counterpointed with incredible quietness, so you're listening out what's going to happen next, and then suddenly a gunshot next to you. So it was about reshaping the scene with sound, and basically a scene that nearly hit the cutting room floor was reanimated by a rethink. Yeah.
Clint, do you want to elaborate on the music side?
No, you covered it. No, I mean that was well put.
Ron?
Not so much on that topic. I mean, you really covered it well.
Well, maybe you could take the next one. So the next one I want to talk about is when Sean Young appears. So many of you probably already know that the work on the visual effects side was that there was a body double, and that was a digital head replacement. But tell us how you created the voice.
Well, we tried to use Sean Young's original voice. She came in, and Byron could explain this better, but they looped her, and her voice had dropped so much because she's a lot older, of course, and it didn't really fit right. So we had different choices of different actors trying to do sound-alike for it, and then there's the actual body double that did the acting, the physical acting. So we had those three choices, and what we ended up with is actually two different actors. We had the body double saying one line, her second line is a sound-alike. And the goal was to match those two, because that's what Denis really loved, was those two readings. So we worked hard to match those two, that you can't tell that there's different people, and that's what we ultimately came up with.
Yeah, it was one of the last things we did. We was in Howard's room. We had 4 actresses come. Of course, the thing about it is we couldn't tell any of. This was the big secret of our movie. This was the big secret. We couldn't say her name out loud. We couldn't write it down.
We had code words for
We
her.
had code words. I had all my ADR sheets locked in a safe. It was, but we brought 4 different actresses in, but they couldn't, that they couldn't audition ahead of time. So we couldn't tell them what they were doing. So we basically had 4 different actresses come in, and we just had them do the scene. We had them do the 2 lines of the new Rachel, and then we also had a couple of them do the owl scene from the original movie before it. So we would have it in case we needed it to match. And at first, Denis did not like it, which is the truth.
Very true.
Very true. And we thought we knocked it out of the park, but boy, what do we know? So they took it back to the cutting room, and they ended up with the first line, the line on the back of her head was there was the 4th of the 4 women, no, the 3rd of the 4 women that came in and did the lines. And then the 4th, the second line is actually the actress that was in the scene, the body double in the scene. And then it matches just fine.
Another scene that you were all saying was particularly challenging was the end of the seawall. Who wants to start on that one?
Well, as I'm sure
I'm
you
gonna chime in.
I wouldn't mind another day.
Yeah, we would love more time on that scene.
It's a tough scene, and it's a hard scene for audiences as well, I'm sure. But the power of the sea was one of the things we were trying to get across. You know, life comes from the sea, it begins in the sea, and there we are, fighting it out.
I think, Ron, you and Doug really should talk most about this scene, although there is a great deal of original effects recording and design for all the elements that make it up. It's a very difficult scene to mix because it requires a real ballet, a real handoff between sound effects and music, and making it feel like it's all of a piece and not hurt your ears at the same time. And I think the heavy lifting fell to you and Doug to make something out of that. Because of course, in one universe, you are constantly being bombarded by waves and screeches and ronks of that ship under pressure, and no audience could stand for that. For how long is that sequence? That's a long cue.
I think it's about almost 10 minutes. Yeah, from the start of
Well,
takeoff to the
why don't you
sequel.
talk? There's some really interesting work in the construction of the music there, because that started life as a suite that Ben wrote.
Yeah,
right?
the end of it.
Yeah, so talk about how you built that cue.
How we reverse engineered the scene.
Yeah.
So the end of it basically started, Ben and Hans had delivered a couple of suites to me in the cutting room, and we were trying to crack the code of that whole back half, musically speaking. We figured that I decided to try part of one of those suites in the part where Love was being killed, sort of that end fight, and sort of roughed it in, got it good. Denis came into my room, he's like, "I deeply love this, play it again." You know, this is his best saying, "I deeply love it." And he says deeply like more than once, you know, you're really in the pocket. And he's the best. I love it.
He's very French.
You lived for I deeply love this.
No, every time you just wanted that affirmation.
Then you don't touch it.
Yeah, then you just leave it, you walk away. So we had the back, but then we didn't have anything leading up to it. We really wanted it to feel like a piece, like, because it really was at the point where Kay is standing there with a gun with 50-foot joy, and then the spinners take off towards the seawall. That was a real moment and a real start of that whole sequence. And we tried a number of ways of doing it, and eventually the back informed the front, and we decided with Hans and Ben, and we were there, and said, well, what if we just tried this theme generally through this whole bit without getting to the point that we're sick and tired of it by the end, if there's some magic way to do that. And it took a bit of work, but we got there. So it was good. It works really well. It plays more like I don't know, it's more operatic in a sense. It was more about the emotional characteristic of that whole moment instead of playing it like an action scene. Yeah.
That was really Denis'
thing.
theme, was that this is an operatic, big, long movement that carries you through that entire scene from when they take off to the end of the death there. So when we first played it, it was just overwhelming. We all sat there like, oh my God, what are we going to do with this? It was just too much of everything, and it was just purely overwhelming. So basically everyone left the room. It was me and Clint like, okay, let's just listen to the music and work this out. You know, we just started working through each track, and we muted some things, we took down other things, spread things out where we could, and you know, a lot of EQing and balancing things out to make this work, and came up with a very good, you know, long sustained feel. And they were like, okay, this sounds good on its own. Let's hear what they got going, and then we'll start trading off and seeing where things sit. So it took a long time, but we finally got to a point where we felt this played. You know, the music played really well, and Denis wanted it to be very enveloping and don't back off on it. You know, I kept trying like, well, I'll give the effects a lot of chance here, and I'd come down. It's like, no, I'm losing the thread. I want to keep this going. So it was a real, it was a very hard to find out how to trade that off and be seamless and say, okay, effects need to hit this part, the things, you know, going underwater, we need to give that to them, the drowning. So I would slowly back off and ease off on certain sounds that allowed sound effects to come through, and it was a very tricky balance. I'm very happy the way it came out, but it was not easy.
There's a lot of passes.
Doug could probably talk about how the waves and everything.
The thing about Denis, working with Denis, is you can't be a Hollywood creature. You know, you look at that sequence, and you know, I bring my Hollywood experience to it, and it's like, well, we could pace this up more, we could go fast. That's not what he's doing. When these guys are talking about a long operatic sequence, that's more what it is. You're not concerned with pacing it up. You're not concerned with action and typical Hollywood sort of you know, machinations. And for me personally, when I came on this film, I was very aware that he does not think like that. He does not think like your average Hollywood director. So I had to get on board for that. And it wasn't hard. It was actually really beautiful and wonderful to be able to do that.
Sort of just to button that point, one of Denis' most frequent communications with us would be in a moment when a decision needed to be made. He would often say to us, "That made me feel this," or "This is what I want to feel." And I think that's critically important for us as sound artists to learn to identify with our work that way, because the only way that we were successful in working with Denis was to connect with that idea of what's the emotion of a scene? What's the narrative thread of a scene? Okay, now how does sound connect to that? You can't get to the sound. You can't start getting granular with sound effects or music until you understand what the director's trying to say, and that's critically important.
And it was really what did tell the story or didn't. And if you were telling a story with what you had, great, play it. And if it didn't, you got to back off and you hand it off to the other department, or you find out where that thread is.
And all these things were in play with Denis, all of it. I mean, we've worked with Sidney Pollack, and he's very narrative driven, he's very plot driven. With Denis, all these things are in play all the time. You know, whether it's just the tone and feel of a sequence that's going to land you in the next shot, or whether it is pushing plot forward or whatever, all that stuff was constantly in play.
Well, I think with all departments, I mean, the thing with him, since we're on the Denis train at the moment, he has a very strong center, a very clear path of where he wants to be emotionally, and how he wants to tell the story, as far as like what story he's trying to tell. Like, we've all worked with people that maybe are trying to find it while we're doing it. That is not Denis. He is very prepared. He knows exactly what he is made, but he hires creative individuals that also have a good sense of storytelling and care, and really expects people to bring it. Like, his direction, always, same with music, is always very just more emotional and general. Like, it was never very specific. I mean, once you sort of got somewhere, he could be more specific-ish, but it was more just about like, this is.
No, he's not going to explain stuff. He's not going to explain
No.
that Vegas is an
In fact, that
artificial
would just kind of wear him out.
Yeah,
It was more just, he would tell you how it felt.
expects you to get it.
And he just like, look, I brought you here. You're supposed to
Right.
bring it. And it's like, and which is awesome. It's the best possible scenario. I mean, as far as a collaborative, just.
He's not the guy that
No.
tells you at 355 feet, turn down the phone.
No.
He's not that guy.
So I'm going to start the Q&A since we have limited time.
Can I have the
There we
other
go.
microphone?
Yes, in the third one.
All right, thank you for sharing all this information with us.
Hold on, we want to have a microphone so people can hear the question.
You're being recorded, by the way.
Thank you. two questions, if I may. One is regarding the collaboration between sound design and music. If you guys could expand a little bit more on that, since it's a very, very, very heavy score in terms of dynamic range and and frequency ranges. I was wondering how how you guys dealt with that. And also, I was very curious about the particular motif of Peter and the Wolf as the logo. And I was wondering what the symbolism, if any, or whose idea was that? And if you guys could talk about that.
The musical, the sort of handoff, if you will, or the collaboration of music and sound effects was, of course, always guided by Denis. But as I had mentioned at the very beginning, Denis had asked Theo and I to think as composers with sound, and in many ways, our earliest designs were very musical without being melodic. In other words, we would create these atmospheres, and almost every scene in the film, if there isn't a cue, has a musical feel or atmosphere to it to give you a vibe about something. And that was this idea of composing with sound such that it freed Ben and Hans to then write that really necessary cues to carry the deep emotional weight.
Yeah, I think part of it was also just bringing us on, both of us, very much earlier than a filmmaker would normally do. I was sound designing, I started about a year ago in Budapest as they were shooting it. And so by the time we had a first cut, pretty much every scene had some sort of sound design on it. And then Mark came on board very shortly afterwards. And I think having a richly developed sound texture for every scene, way before it was ever handed to the composers, must have helped guide them as to how to fit in the tonalities. And I think then a hell of a lot of work was done by Clint and Ron to integrate those into the mix and to make sure that we weren't clashing.
Yeah, as far as Peter and the Wolf, I mean, all I could.
That came straight from Denis.
Did you bring Peter and Wolf, or was that Joe?
That was Joe.
I think it was Joe. I think it was just Joe. Seems like a very Joe thing, and I think it was him. But it was mostly. I think we tried a number of like ringtones and stuff, and we just kept thinking.
I tried endless amounts of sort of standard ringtones.
Everything sounded too much like an Apple commercial or a Microsoft.
Yeah, Joe put in Peter and the Wolf, and it just kind of stuck like early on, and we're like, that's actually kind of cool. So,
and we had to replace every single one of them with Peter.
Yes, we did. But I don't think it really had any specific meaning other than that. Although maybe in hindsight we could read something into it, but I don't think it was intent.
No, it was more the feel of the thing. It was a friendly thing, and it's sort of, I guess, harking back to something classical. I think. Yeah.
I was just curious how you created the sound of the forensic scientist going through the bones, because I thought that just sounded amazing.
It starts life, believe it or not, as crazy as that machine sounds, a good portion of it is that actual machine. I mean, that's an actual wild track of that thing.
Yeah, we layered a bunch of other sort of small sounds over it, but the strange sound of the maneuvering of the kind of the head that's supposed to be looking at the bones comes from the prop on set.
You guys never
It's production sound.
Imagine that.
You're gonna come up with some cool story, man.
I wish I could. Yeah, I wish I had something more exotic to tell you. But big props to Lee Gilmore, one of our sound effects editors, who did a masterful job of mining some of the more interesting kind of machinations of that wild track to give it a little bit of character. He really made the most out of that recording. And then I think you made some of the lens switching sounds.
Yeah,
and
Lee made sort of MRI type kind of textures that make you feel like the technology that we're sort of familiar with is being used. But yeah, there's some great X-ray sort of sounds that Lee Gilmore came up with. I remember that were when we see the box, Zappa's lock box. That was something that was all Lee Gilmore. Yeah.
We got another question.
It's a great film. I love the sound, and I just have like two sound parts, sound effects that I just really appreciated. One was those little black droney things that followed the guy.
Barracudas, we called them.
Yeah, that sound was totally awesome, and I just kind of want to know what made up that sound. And then also like those off-screen car vibes, like throughout the city, or like whenever those cars are flying by, you could just hear them from like miles away. You always knew they were coming, and I was like, whoa, it's epic. So just like where'd those sounds come from, I guess? Like,
The barracudas, the little black probes, were hand magnets. Nothing done to them whatsoever, just manipulated in your hand. I don't know if you've ever played with them, but they make that clicky, buzzy noise, especially when they get very close to each other, they vibrate. And this was a sound that Dave Whitehead, a longtime collaborator of mine, sent to me as part of a palette, and this is a term we use a lot, a palette of sounds, not knowing where they would be used. He had no idea what I might use that for, and that just stuck. And I got my first, I deeply love this. From Denis when he heard that sound. But Theo, I think you're responsible for all those distant traffic sounds. Those have lived in the track since the earliest days.
Yeah, they're like processed trucks passing is one of the elements there, and a native Australian bull roarer, which is one of those sort of things. Like a long string with a boomerang on the end that makes a really frightening sound. Those are elements that we use for those spinner cars passing.
Next question.
Okay, I'm going to crawl over some people.
Hey all, just congratulations. This is awesome sounding film, awesome film in general. My question is about Kay's gun. So was that a sound that Denny was really attached to? Did he really emphasize, all right guys, Kay's gun, here we go. Like, how is this going to sound? Or was it just kind of, you guys did something, and he's like, oh, love it, cool.
No,
Many iterations.
there were many, many iterations and failures, but it was in fact the first sound design project that Joe and Denis handed to me. And I went off and I made several iterations of it and never got it right until Theo had sort of I started with, and we ended up with, it's made of two sounds, two mono sounds. It's made of a Barrett 50 cal that I had recorded, a huge sniper rifle with a round that big that has a giant kick, and because we knew we wanted it to be a conventional weapon. It's not science futuristic, it's not a laser, it's got a charge and a round. But I could never quite get that other little something to give it the kick that it has until Theo offered.
Yeah, it was as simple as one of those sort of 909 bass kick drums, processed so that it gets to the point of distortion, mixed together with
It's a 50-50 combo of two mono sounds.
That's very cool.
And then Doug, of course, it's not great because just the sound that we Doug had to actually make it look like it did something.
Thanks, guys.
Any more questions?
We've got one in here.
Hi. Great movie. Great job. I'm in awe. I was wondering how much time and effort you spent referring to the original Blade Runner for the feel, the emotion, sound, and music, because I felt like Vangelis was in the room the whole time.
Well, Ron and I 8 years ago mixed on Ridley's version, which is the no narration, so that's sort of embedded in our DNA, so to speak. And I think, other guys can speak on this, I think embedded is the right word to use, because it's all of us are so into this world that it just becomes part of our daily existence. It just gets in our bloodstream. I don't know, how do you guys feel about that?
That's true. I mean, having mixed that with Ridley and understanding what he was after and hearing the stories, all that really had an effect on us to do this version. I was so happy when we got the call to do this, having done the first one, as you know, not the original mix, but his final cut version. Also, Denis had a very strong sense of what he wanted the music to sound like and the feel that it should have. And I can't tell you how many times we muted things that were too new, like any Omnisphere, and I'm not bagging on Omnisphere, but any things like that. He just like, I love that sound, but I don't want it in my movie. And he would go back to the CS80, that was the original Vangelis synth that they used a lot, or almost all, and he just loved that sound, so he would call up band and say, I want more CS80. It became a joke, like, oh, here we go.
And we need it now.
So,
We're on the
it
stage.
harkened back to that all the time, and we used it quite a lot.
He had these really cute catchphrases for those Blade Runner moments. So one was that whenever you heard one of those signature pitch dives, he called that the seagull. And that giant sort of revving thing he called the motorcycle,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
So that was short of
Which is in the music, it's not a sound effect, but
And
you can't tell.
as far as the music goes, I know that we were trying to find the film, like early in the editorial, as the process went along, it became clear, like, look, we know the DNA of this film, we know that this is a different film than the original film, but it's still, it really needs to live in that world. It wasn't even really a question. But the question was, how do we make it do that without sort of copying it? And so the score, Ben and Hans just really, I mean, they created what I have been referring to as a very reverential nod to the original score without being rip, with the exception of the obvious cover at the end, which was very intentional. But yeah, that actually was a total cover. Like, they just replayed everything, tried to nail it, and did an amazing job based off of a really bastardized edit I did of that original cue, and they copied it. But yeah,
It was right down to the last bell sound.
down to the wrong notes and everything that were clashing. But yeah,
I mean, how they had to find that exact bell sound of the Tears in the Rain.
yeah, no,
They had to make that exactly like it, so it felt like the original.
they definitely nailed it.
I think we got time for 2 more questions, and you got one in the back.
And then we have one here too.
Hello, great movie. Thank you for that. One question: I believe that the musical score was replaced in a fairly late stage of post-production. I was wondering how that affected your work in sound design.
Oof. I'd have to say it didn't affect my work in the sound design at all. I mean, I think it probably affected Ron and Doug's work in the mix more than the sound design. I'd been kind of working, as Mark had, on the sound design pretty much isolated from score for most of the time. I think probably the challenges came because we did a temp mix here at Sony, not in this theatre, but in the Cary Grant. And at that point, we didn't have any, I don't think we had any music.
It was all temp.
It was all
A
temp.
couple of older Johann stuff, but it was very few, maybe 8 minutes, 10 minutes of Johann, and then a bunch of temp.
So I mean, I think the main challenge was probably that we then had to take that mix, strip the music out,
And we're starting over.
And it completely changed from that temp dub to what Hans and Ben brought, because it
was definitely a progression, though. That's what it felt like to me. It sort of just kept moving until Hans and Ben came on, and then definitely was like, okay, now we're cooking.
As Theo was saying, Denis had really given us free rein to design, irrespective, and as I said too, we were given a cut without music, and we were encouraged to design as if music might not exist. And then I have to assume that in his discussions with Ben and Hans, he's hearing the work we did on the temp mixes, and they're reacting to that and creating these sort of seamless dovetails in and out of what they were hearing.
Yeah, I mean, we're very conscious, obviously, of when sound effects were playing in those melodic times when there's no music, and as they dovetail into a cue, it's like, okay, does that chime or that tone work, and how does that dovetail into the start of my cue? And sometimes, Doug and I had to work a lot about what came out and what came in, and to match that so that it was seamless. But a lot of times it works just perfectly. You just slide right in, and other times we had to really, adjust things and see how they dovetailed together, because it was so rich. It's like an embarrassment of riches. You've got the best of both.
Yeah.
How do they all fit together?
Actually, Joe Walker, the picture editor, had a really good word for what Ron is talking about, chamfered. we would chamfer it.
Woodworking too.
I know, it's such a great word, but anyway, there's
He's British.
a lot of chamfering going on.
There's a great moment in the film that's kind of comments on your question, but in a very different way. You remember the sequence when Kay gets to the desert and everything goes kind of orange and auburn colors, and it's marked by these gigantic booms that are reminiscent of the first film. That scene, Denis had said to me on day one, is going to have a huge piece of score because that needs to talk about the blackout and the devastation and the nuclear blast that wiped out Las Vegas. So we always kind of steered clear of that scene. But we had placed these booms in place, and Ben had put them in the queue, in the places we had them, for that entire scene. And on the final day, Denis said, I want those booms bigger. And we just didn't really have them. So I asked Ron, who's one of the world's great percussionists, please make some new booms, some Blade Runner-like booms. He brought them in.
You know when you're off time.
Yeah, it was at 2 in the morning.
Between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m.
So he brings them in for the final day of the final mix of that reel, and he's working on the boom. So he's taken the cue out so he can listen to this piece of sound effect. And that's when Denis' ear pricks up and he says, wait, what are you doing?
That's the cue.
That's it. And he said, I want to hear it like that. And so what went from a moment, and this is not meant as a way of denigrating music, but as a way of underlining Denis' brilliance and ability to hear something different. He heard Ron just playing footsteps and booms, and he said, that's the essence of this scene. Let's try it like that. All through an accident of you working on those sounds.
Yeah, I literally recorded, I layered up a lot of different drums at home, and I have a mix, room in my house at 7-1, and I mixed them all, brought them to Clint. He cut them in that morning, and we literally put them in right then. And he liked them so much, we used them throughout the whole movie. The very first sound you hear is my bass drum at home. So it's, it's like, okay, here we go. So we ended up using them a lot as like chapter things, different transitions. The Vegas walk is probably the obvious one, and every time you hear one of those big booms, that's where it came from. So it's all because he heard something in there that he really focused in and wanted. And he kept saying, get rid of that, get rid of that, get rid of that. I'm like, Denis, all I have left are the bass drums. Yeah. He's like, play it. I'm like, I play it. We're like, God damn, that really worked. So it was cool. I was very happy, obviously.
You got one more question?
Yeah, this question is a little bit for both sound design and the mix. I noticed that obviously you guys did mix in the Dolby Atmos format, and how much pre-thinking went into designing what would be up in the Atmos array as opposed to like a 5.1 or 7.1 mix? Same with mixing, was that pre-thought out, or is that more of like an on-stage feeling type of thing?
From the sound effects standpoint, I can't speak to music, we did no pre-planning. I really wanted Doug to make those decisions. Because this was done as a virtual mix, meaning everything came to the desk in a Pro Tools session, every sound was granular and separate, so Doug had the ability to really create an environment with these sounds in a way that he thought was most fitting. I didn't want to preordain that.
And you guys probably know, but just in case you don't, we work virtually these days, so we have all the material at our fingertips all the time to the very end, so we can readjust or whatever. Nothing gets baked in, it's all separate. So yeah, we work virtually.
Interestingly, our Dolby technician told us that, maybe this will surprise you, that this film, because they keep track of the amount of data that the objects consume, because it has to, you have to make a DCP out of this thing, and they said this film took up more data than any other film they had mastered, but for an interesting reason. Not because of the sound effects, because in fact, we don't really do a lot of object work with sound effects. It was mostly the work that Clint and Ron did in draping every speaker with these separations in the music.
Yeah. I mean, we literally had, 3 or 4 or 5 ones? The rest were all stereo tracks. So it really wasn't mixed as normal. Like, normally you'd get, whatever, 10 to 17, who knows how many 5/1 mixes from a composer that had an engineer then mix it. We got a lot of these, most of the tracks from Ben himself.
Yeah, they were straight from Ben.
Straight from his room, like, here's all the stereos, you guys mix it. Like, okay, great. It's a tall order, but we had a great time doing it. I mean, Clint and I just sat down and said, okay, this works great, we'll get rid of these, move that there, and just moved them around the room and found out where stuff would sit and balanced it out that way. So it was truly created by feel and intent to tell a story, and also wrap you in the room where you were enveloped. And Denis loved getting it all around you and really embracing you throughout the film, and especially in that seawall scene at the end. That was, and also the opening with the eyes. Like, I want to start bold, and I want to really envelop everyone and said, this is it. We're starting. This is Blade Runner.
Myri, you did a lot of work as well. You put a lot of those PAs and voices and adverts, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Talking to them, not you. Yeah, I mean, we put up a lot of, in the pre-dubs we did this a lot. We put like, the decompressing, when it gets decompressed after a stressful work, then we put the voice in the ceiling. We worked a lot on the memory maker with the voice in the ceiling.
Yeah,
Wallace in the ceiling. What else did we put?
The baseline test.
The baseline test, yeah.
It was meant to be very oppressive and all on top of you, and it just was like the worst place you want to be, and you just want to get this over with. So we tried to really get it on top of you and be oppressive.
Right, and the second one, we started out with it and we focused in as more got towards the end. We focused more as we went to the last one.
Right.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time on, and a lot of the adverbs were in the, at the end of reel one for us. But before he goes into his apartment, all of the adverts were above, and we panned down on them. They had the off-world announcement and a joy ad, and they all panned, and they all ended up in the ceiling.
Probably BB's Bar would be the other one where we're outside, and it's like a planned chaos, if you will, because every single one was placed in a perfect spot, and they all moved around, but it was meant to be very chaotic and just like overwhelming.
Okay, we do have to wrap up. I'm sorry, but Tommy, do you have any remarks?
No. I just thank you, Carolyn, for moderating, and Blade Runner team. Thank you. Thank you for letting us screen the film and share the creative process that you guys did. It was just amazing.
Before everyone goes, I got to shout out Tommy McCarthy and Sony Studios. You guys are so committed to giving to the sound community. Thank you for putting these on and giving a shit about this.
And we have about you guys.